Time to talk a little bit of technology. Matthew Dickinson, good morning to you.
Hopefully I'll be much clearer than the naming of those songs.
I get a little mystified with that, but I do really enjoy Passenger a lot. Look, it's funny to think at the moment we're looking at the news, we're seeing flooding everywhere. Of course, bushfires will be a reality before we know it again. Could satellite technology change the way we tackle our bushfires?
Yeah, I think so. And obviously we know with climate change, we're going to get more intense bushfires, we're going to get more of them. So the reality is we've got to have some better way to address it. The last major bushfire was only a year ago before COVID came along. About 18 million hectares of land was burnt out across Australia. So pretty bad in terms of what it can do.
Made news around the world. It was
Absolutely,
amazing.
yeah. And the smoke plume, I mean, NASA was capturing the smoke plumes that travelled around the world.
I forgot about that, yeah.
So we want to have some better way of obviously addressing that. There's some really interesting research that's been done, and it started with a scientist who was looking for supernovae billions, literally billions of light years away from Earth. And he was trying to work out a way to see these little dots of light with all the background noise, and he worked out the 39 micron wavelength was where the light came through from these supernovae.
Okay.
And that's the same frequency or the same wavelength that bushfires, when they start, when they're very young and they just start burning, you've got this little tiny dot of light. So from a satellite that might be a few hundred kilometres above the Earth, this little dot, if you focus on the 39 micron wavelength, you can pick up that dot before it's a bushfire. It's really when it's just a small fire. Now the claim, Nick, this sounds quite incredible to me.
A little open mouth here. This is amazing.
The claim is that they will be able to pick up 65% of bushfires within a minute of their age. So at a minute old, it's not a bushfire.
No.
It's a little tiny fire. So the idea is if they can get some water or some fire retardant onto that when it's that old, then it doesn't become a bushfire. So quite incredible. The idea is that they'll pick up 100% of bushfires within 10 minutes, but that kind of 65% within the first minute of them evolving. The photos are taken from low Earth orbit satellites, so we're only talking about a few hundred kilometres above the Earth. Photos are taken by those, pick up those little tiny pinpricks of light at the right wavelength, and then alert the authorities, hey, over here in the Blue Mountains or out there in the Western Plains of New South Wales, wherever, there's the beginning, a lightning strike, a cigarette butt, whatever it is. Go and get onto that now.
Now, is this just a concept? Are we talking about using satellites that are already up there, or are we actually purpose building here?
They are purpose building. There's a particular company that's purpose building satellites and launching satellites, but they've been doing some experiments with the California bushfires over the last season, and they've been using some geostationary satellites. So it's not as good because they're at 35,786 kilometres, so a little bit further away. But they've been able to pick up over there about 800 bushfires in their infancy and were able to get onto those. They didn't capture every bushfire across California. It was really a trial, but the proof of concept was there. So now they know it's worthwhile going and launching low Earth orbit satellites, get them up there and get them start to detect these bushfires. They're talking about as early as next year, they'll have some of these satellites up and running around.
Next year. So how many do they want to have up there once the whole network's complete?
Yeah, and again, they're focusing on Australia, obviously,
Yeah, okay.
and so probably at this stage, they'll only need to have maybe a small number, maybe 40, 50.
Right,
I mean,
okay.
low Earth orbit satellites are pretty cheap and easy to put up in relative terms.
Yeah.
But obviously, the idea of a low Earth orbit satellite is it's spinning around the world, so it's not over the one spot all the time, so you need a few to cover an area. The idea will be to get this network across the world, because why just use it for Australia? Why not use it across the world?
It's funny, I think you're right. We do tend to think satellites as almost these moonraker style, giant devices. But modern technology, it's almost the equivalent of a mobile phone floating around up there.
They put up very small boxes now as satellites and launch them up. One of the issues and one of the reasons that lots of satellite companies have multiple satellites is to cover an area, but also because they figure some are going to be knocked out with space junk or other satellites up there, because space is pretty big, but it is getting a bit crowded in some of these particular distances away from Earth.
We've done a good job of making it filthy already, haven't we?
Yeah, we have. Yeah. Well, why forget polluting the Earth when we'll start polluting space now?
Let's stick with being in the air. It's been a long time since I've been on an international flight, but I remember when I was still flying, a lot of the airlines would trumpet the fact that they had in-flight Wi-Fi finally, actually getting internet access. I remember using it once and being not exactly overwhelmed by the experience. I'm not going to lie to you.
You could almost say it was false advertising, couldn't
Yeah,
you?
a little bit.
You get on there, it was expensive, it was slow. So what I tend to find myself doing was if I was entering emails, I'd stay offline, I'd go through entry emails, do whatever, then connect for 5 or 10 minutes while it synchronise those emails and then disconnect again. But that was when they were using it, and I thought the technology was pretty cool because they were actually connecting to geostationary satellites, ones that sit directly above a spot on the Earth. And then they were using antennas, a little bubble you would see on top of the plane, to direct the signal to those geostationaries as this plane flew along at close to Mach 1. So pretty incredible technology.
That is amazing,
It
actually.
is, but they figured that wasn't quite fast enough and the latency was there and it was a bit frustrating and your experience was common. So there's a company now, OneWeb, who's actually got to the point where they're basically building a new network of satellites ready for specifically flights when we get back in the air. They're talking about download speeds of 195 megabits per second, better than most people's NBN that are sitting here on the ground.
I do not get that at home.
So you've got to go for a flight to get some decent internet. It will be at the point where they'll be using low Earth orbit again, so they'll be much closer. The latency will be reduced. But because there's so many satellites there as well, and they are talking about a couple of hundred in this particular example, they'll be able to be in much better contact with those planes. So be able to hand off from one satellite to the next as they go over the top of the plane. So essentially more reliable, much faster. They haven't talked about the price. So whether or not it's something to encourage people back in the air, they'll be doing it for free to begin with, because that'll be the big challenge for all these airlines, getting people to fly again. And this might be one of those ways I'll say, hey, you can still have your Zoom meeting on the plane and annoy everyone else on the plane while you're doing that Zoom meeting.
Oh boy. Look, obviously perfect for important people like you. Me, I just need a glass of bourbon and Paddington too on the in-flight entertainment. I'm a very, very happy man. Look, we've talked satellites, we've talked satellite internet while we're in the air. What about satellite internet in your backyard?
There's a big battle going on.
There is a battle.
And if it's a battle, you may as well have it between the two richest people in the world. What the heck?
Who?
Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk are the two main, or they're heading up the two main companies that are battling it out. Starlink you may have heard of. That's one of the offshoots of Elon Musk's SpaceX company.
I think we talked about it a couple of months ago, actually.
Yeah, that's right. Now, they've got some people in trials at the moment in the US, in Canada, in the UK. About 10,000 people are already using the Starlink service.
Right.
They're getting download speeds of 120 megabits per second. Again, better than most people's NBN. But at the moment, there's only the 10,000. When they get to the stage when they roll it out properly, and we talk about hundreds of thousands or millions of people, will they be able to keep up that sort of speed? Now, one of the ways they want to keep up that sort of speed is by having not 10 or 20 or a couple of hundred satellites up there, but we're talking about several thousand satellites just around the Starlink service. Now, Amazon's got a service as well. OneWeb we mentioned, they'll have some sort of service as well. Telesat as well. So there's battlegrounds going on here, Nick, for that satellite service. And when you consider that, sure, we live in Dubbo and you can get connected to the NBN and fibre to the premises, that's fantastic. But you don't have to go that far out of a populated area to then have to put up with either fixed wireless, which is okay, or mobile broadband, which is okay-ish, or normal satellite, the NBN satellite, which is geostationary, which is terrible. When you start to get to the stage when you get these sort of connections, it means it just opens up whole areas that can then get reasonable sort of speed. So this is going to be a battleground, and the winner is going to have the riches of regional areas across the world.
Now, are they just testing this in the US or at the moment, or are they broadening out that test zone?
Now, Starlink is in Canada, in the UK, and in the US, so they are getting those places there. Typically what happens when they launch low Earth orbit, it's more around the actual distance from the equator, so that effectively, normally, a satellite will spin around the equator or at a latitude or longitude above or below the equator. So if you've got something that's sitting there at Australia, for example, everywhere else at that same distance from the equator in the southern hemisphere will get access to that same satellite. So when you launch it, you've got a whole swath of countries that are around that same area. The hardest parts to get to are the North and South Pole, but not a lot of people live there, so they're not that concerned about those areas.
I'm just looking at the pricing here, and for Starlink, nearly $500 up front and about $100 a month. That's going to be comparable with a lot of people's setups at home.
The upfront cost is a bit of the killer there,
that is
$500 there,
expensive, yeah.
but $100 a month, that's within reason of other connections, other services. They might vary anywhere from say 70 to $120 a month, so it's within reason. And if you had nothing, or you had very poor service away from a populated area, $100 a month would be nothing to pay for getting some sort of reasonable connection, especially if you were able to get 120 megabits per second. But I put a big asterisk next to that.
Big asterisk.
Yeah, when they start to get some quantities of people using it, I'm not sure they'll be able to maintain that sort of speed.
Yeah, look, do we have a time frame when Jeff and Elon's particular options are going to be sort of a little more widely available?
Well, the trials, and the Amazon service is running some trials as well at the moment.
Right.
So they're running trials. I imagine, we don't have a definite date. If you ever listen to Elon, he will promise things way before they're ever available. So Elon's made no promises with this one at the moment, which worries me even further. But I suspect within maybe a year, possibly 18 months,
Wow.
we'll be able to see some people be able to connect to that in places like Australia.
It's a reasonably rapid turnaround for that.
Yeah. And they are getting so quick to launch some of these satellites now. You've got companies like SpaceX, a number of companies around the world launching these satellites up. As we mentioned, they're much smaller, they're much cheaper, they're easier to get them up in the air, so it's actually not as long a roll as it would have been in the past.
Well, let's keep our fingers crossed on that. Matthew Dickinson, we'll leave it there. We'll talk again in a fortnight.
Thanks, Nick.
Matthew Dickinson, our regular tech expert. We're 5 minutes away from 10 o'clock. A little bit of Patti Smith, Because the Night.